Welcome back, everyone. I'm Henry Goldschmidt. I'm the Director of Programs at the Interfaith Center of New York. And I just want to give a shout out to Hanedi and all of my other colleagues who've been working so hard on this conference. I'm really delighted to be part of the conversation. I am specifically delighted to moderate our next panel, exploring faith-based perspectives on food justice and food security, and more broadly, the role of food in our cultural and religious and spiritual lives. It's one of the kind of fundamental principles of this conference, of the whole series of Rabbi Marshall Meyer retreats, and also a fundamental principle of the Interfaith Center's work, is that we can learn from each other's faith traditions in ways that will inspire and motivate our own work and also make our work more effective. You know, we can expand our understanding of food justice issues and really, this might be like a pretentious term, but it can spark our moral imagination to kind of hear how different faith traditions understand and reflect on these issues. And then also more practically, you know, if you're working on these issues in your own community and your own congregation, there's a lot you can learn by seeing how other communities, other congregations are addressing the same issues. So for both practical and more spiritual reasons, I think this is going to be a really rich conversation. I'm looking forward to it. Let me very briefly introduce our panelists. I'm not going to read their entire bios, but I just put a link in the chat to a page on ICNY's website that has our speakers' bios. So I'm not going to take the time to recite their bios, but just to say I'm delighted and grateful to be joined by Kiana Davis, who is the Social Action and Social Justice Manager at Congregation B'nai Jeshurun on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And Yamina Kezadri. Yamina, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing. I apologize in advance for mispronouncing anyone's name. But Yamina is her bio says the de facto executive director of Muslims Giving Back. I need to ask her another time what how she ended up a de facto executive director. But Yamina is a leader of the organization Muslims Giving Back. Dr. Rucha Kaur, who is the Community Development Director at the Sikh Coalition and a founding board member of the Interfaith Public Health Network. And we're also expecting to be joined in a few minutes by Dr. Lyla Johnston, who is an indigenous Native American musician, author, and community organizer. And hopefully Dr. Lyla will be with us soon. And again, you can learn more about all of our speakers, their bios. There's a link to their bios in the chat. Before I turn it over to them, I just want to say one important qualification. And I believe Dr. Lyla is about to join us. It's important to remember that each of our speakers is speaking from their perspective in a given, faith tradition or cultural tradition. They're speaking from their community and tradition, but they are not speaking on behalf of their community and tradition. Every faith community is extraordinarily diverse within itself. There's no one voice that represents all Jews, all Muslims, all Native Americans, all Sikhs. So I think we can learn a lot from these speakers, and we will learn a lot about their faith traditions and communities, but we shouldn't put on them the kind of undue burden of feeling as though they have to represent their entire faith. So with that, let me turn it over to our speakers. I'm going to ask them each just to introduce themselves briefly, talk for maybe 4 or 5 minutes, share a little bit about their background in food justice work, including any specific programs that they or their organizations are offering, and a little bit about how their faith or their culture inspires and guides their work. So let me turn first. Dr. Lyla, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Um,
Sorry for having the wrong link this morning, but
oh,
I'm
no
I'm here.
worries. No
Thank you.
worries. It's life on Zoom. But Lyla June, if I can turn to you first, just to briefly, a few minutes, introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your work in food justice.
Yes, of course. So first of all, greetings, my kin and my people. I'm from the Nanisht Ejitachitni clan of the Diné nation. We are also incorrectly known as Navajo. Aro my father's mother is the Southern Cheyenne clan, and my mother's father is the Salt clan, and my father's father is the European clans. Akut ego Diné Asanishna. In that manner, I present myself as a Diné woman, and I worked on my PhD was all about pre-colonial indigenous land management, the ways in which Native people would take care of the land to produce these really sustainable regenerative food systems on a landscape scale, and sort of debunking the myth that Native people were just scattered bands of nomads running around trying to find a berry to eat or a deer to hunt, but rather they were very intentionally and expertly cultivating the food bearing capacity of the land on landscape scales, and in many cases still do, and really seeing what we can learn about that for today's food systems.
Thank you. Anything else you want to add about programs you're working on or other parts of your research?
Oh, well, we're right now we're taking care of an endangered sheep breed that my people have been stewarding for thousands and thousands of years. They're called a
Mm,
churro, Navajo churro sheep, and they have four horns, and they're very sacred to us because we honor the four directions.
mm,
And they've been taking care of us, and we've been taking care of them for a long, long time. Um, and other than that, just doing what I can to support native foodway keepers, whether they're seed keepers or taking care of ecosystems in the old way, and just generally the cheerleader for all indigenous land managers that are doing incredible work. Everything from the terra preta, protectors in the Amazon who built out these entire soil systems just with their bare hands over millennia, to the folks who take care of the herring migrations up in Pacific Northwest and Alaska, to the Shumash who oversaw an 11,000-year-old abalone fishery and are still fighting to protect that, to the Piscataway in Washington D.C. who oversaw a 3,000-year-old oyster fishery and are still fighting to do that despite so many onslaughts. And those who take care of the buffalo, etc. So just whatever I can to protect the protectors and uplift them and fund them and whatever else I
mm.
can do to support them. And everyone
Thank
around the world too. It's not just a Native American thing, it's a very human thing that we find throughout the world, is the land defenders and the water protectors are everywhere.
you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Let me turn now to Yamina. If you could tell us a little bit about your background and what's up at Muslims Giving Back.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Henry. My name is Yamina Kezadri. Firstly, I'd like to start with our greetings of peace and Islam. Assalamu alaikum to all, and thank you so much for joining us. I am the executive director of Muslims Giving Back, and I have a master's degree in public health policy and management from SUNY Downstate. I've been highly involved with the work of Muslims Giving Back for over 10 years now in addressing the multifaceted emergency programs and relief services that's needed within our communities at large. I'd like to start with the Islamic way of addressing food, and that is ensuring that people know that Muslims have to adhere to halal food principles, and halal entails cleanliness and purity and compliance with specific Islamic principles. The principles of halal food include ensuring that the food is prepared in a specific way, and that entails Islamic dietary restrictions and laws that do not contain any form of forbidden materials or contaminants, So that would include pork, alcohol, intoxicant materials, harmful ingredients, and any form of unsanitary elements and poisons. So the meat that we consume has to be slaughtered the biha way, and that is in a most dignified way for the animal, and that is the animal has to submit to the sacrifice itself. So it needs to be done in a very humane way for the animal. So it is like we treat our, animals that we sacrifice for the consumption of our food needs in a very holistic and dignified sense. So with that, Islam is given to us that we need to feed the people, feed our neighbors, and feed the hungry around us. And it's very important for us to maintain that. So the ways that Muslims Giving Back has been addressing some of the food insecurity needs throughout the city is through battling the food insecurities by adopting comprehensive, healthy food environment improvements within our communities through multiple programs, which many of you might be aware of, via the Hunger Truck, which is the big red fiery truck that you guys see around, where we provide hot meals to the communities, specifically as of lately to the migrant communities within these respite and shelter spaces all throughout the city. The other program that we are also operating is the Halal Mobile Food Pantry Service Program, where we address the the food deserts and food swamp areas within New York City or throughout New York City to serve the communities in need and in despair, in an effort to reach to the communities within these specific areas. The program helps support faith-based communities who aren't able to open up and operate their own pantry services and programs for the communities that they serve. So through the mobile food service program, we are able to showcase the needs of the community and try to accommodate them in feasible ways to attempt to bridge the gaps of services. This allows for robust dietary restricted service program building and the community's needs for the food products that they need access to or lack access to, that is. So the program has been piloted for the past 2 years and has been a huge success, and need has arisen, especially that with the migrant crisis and the increase of or lack of actually support with regards to SNAP benefits within certain communities and the cutbacks in funding and budgeting. And we also have our our actual in-house food pantry service program, where we serve over thousands of individuals within a month, 1,000 families. That would be over 10,000 families altogether through our in-house pantry service program, in partnership with other organizations and other nonprofit orgs and funders that help support the cause of, addressing the social disparities and health disparities of the South Brooklyn area.
Excuse me. Thank you, Yamina. I appreciate it. Let me now turn to Kiana Davis. Kiana, you could tell us a little bit about your background and the work you're doing at B'nai Jeshurun.
Morning, all. My name is Kiana Davis. I am the Social Action and Social Justice Manager at B'nai Jeshurun. We're a large synagogue on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. We've been around a long time, and we have about 2,000 member families in our community. I use she, her pronouns. Prior to my role at BJ, I've been here about 2.5 years. Prior to coming to B'nai Jeshurun, I worked for about 7 years in policy, advocacy, and direct services related to public benefits, and namely working with folks on food stamp enrollment and representing them in civil hearings when issues arose for individuals related to their public benefits. And I also briefly worked with Grow NYC at one of the largest green markets in the city, where I was as a manager at that market, but directly overseeing the exchange of food stamps, for tokens. If you've shopped at a farmer's market in New York recently, you've probably engaged with it yourself. If you've used a credit card or an EBT card at a farmer's market, you get tokens in exchange. And if you are using a SNAP card, as Kate McKenzie mentioned, you also get vouchers. So I oversaw that program at one of the markets in Brooklyn. So when it came to B'nai Jeshurun, I was already somewhat well versed in the world of sort of food insecurity and food justice. And BJ has been doing work around food justice for a very long time. We've operated a soup kitchen for over 30 years.
I thought
At
you were
BJ. Oh, sorry. And we serve a homemade meal once a week to about 75 folks in the community. We also run a CSA out of BJ, which is a community-sponsored agriculture where we partner with a local farm to bring in fresh produce, and our members support the farm by paying an upfront fee for a season's worth of produce shares. We have focused a lot on our sustainability efforts, reducing our food waste in our own programs and ordering. And we've started working with a food rescue organization as well to ensure that when we have events with leftovers, those aren't just going to waste, but those are actually being redistributed to community sites that use them. We've started to prioritize more plant-based foods being served at our own events. We do a lot of work around compost and compost education. We've been a community compost site for many years, and we were one of the first sites to come back after the city paused community compost for a few years during the pandemic. And more recently, we have, like many groups I've heard already on this call, been working with some of the local shelters who are housing refugees and asylum seekers. We've specifically partnered with a shelter on the Upper West Side and hosted a series of community dinners, which is really focused on not just providing nourishment and a hot home-cooked meal, but also bringing community together. So it's really about ensuring that we're inviting all the folks from this local shelter who we've partnered with, but also from our own community to really be sitting down and eating the same food together, breaking bread together, getting to know each other, and really holding up those values of hospitality and community connection, and really bringing people together around food, which I think many of our traditions have a lot of things to say about.
Yeah, thank you, Kiana. And we will certainly come back to that question of bringing people together around food and, maybe ideally bridging divides between people with food. I also just want to mention very briefly, B'nai Jeshurun, where Kiana works, was formerly led for many years by Rabbi Marshall Meyer, under whose name we are meeting today. So I'm especially pleased to have someone from BJ part of the conversation today. And finally, let me turn to Rucha Kaur from the Sikh Coalition and the Interfaith Public Health Network.
Morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I'm very grateful to the organizers and the attendees for joining us in this important conversation. Like Dr. Goldschmidt said, my name is Rucha Kaur. I'm the Community Development Director at the Sikh Coalition. I've been organizing in the Sikh community for about 14 years, a little bit over 14 years. And at the Sikh Coalition, I lead the organization's grassroots and overall community engagement agenda. So we work nationally with Sikh community members to ensure that Sikhs are able to protect and practice their faith freely. At IPHN, I have the absolute privilege of serving as a board member. IPHN, the Interfaith Public Health Network, is an organization where we work with diverse faith communities to advance public health outcomes. And a significant portion of our work focuses on connecting faith communities and how we're thinking critically about food systems and how they impact our health. And this is happening through conversation. This is happening through engaging in policy. This is happening through bringing people together to start having those conversations. And how are we really channeling that power of community and faith to work on public health inequities and disparities. I'm a practicing Sikh and just by way of quick background, it is the 5th largest faith in the world with about 25 million practitioners around the world. United States is home to anywhere between 500 to 750,000 Sikhs. New York is home to one of the largest Sikh populations in the country. I'm sure if you're in Queens, you will see many community members. The men in the community especially are very visible with the turban and the beard. One of the core tenets of Sikhi are equality, social justice, and service, and selfless service without any expectations back. And serving and feeding our communities, other communities, our fellow human beings is the operationalization of these values of equality and service. Nowhere is this seen better than in Langar, which is a free vegetarian communal meal that is available at every gurdwara, no matter where you are in the world. It is a meal that is prepared by volunteers, served by volunteers. Everybody sits on the floor and breaks bread together, which is symbolic of how we are all equal in the eyes of God. That is, like I said, the operationalization of those values of equality and service and giving back. And I just want to tell a little short story from Sikh history about how this kind of understanding of serving others and feeding others came about. So the first guru, or the founder of the faith, Guru Nanak, when he was a young boy, a young man, his father gave him a sum of money to go to another town and learn how to do business. And on his way to the other town, he met some people, some folks who were in need, and they were hungry and they needed food. And so he chose to use the money that his father had given him to do business. He chose to use that money to feed that group of people. So when he was asked, like, you were meant to learn about how to do transactions, how to do business. And Guru Nanak said that the Sacha Sauda, the true business, the true transaction, is that of feeding and connecting with people. And that really is the basis of where Langar comes from, the basis of where that understanding or that ideal of serving others comes from. There is nothing that is more important and nothing that is of more value, or that is a better investment than investing in the health and well-being of our fellow human beings. So when I'm asked, where does this understanding of how I do my work and how what inspires me to do the work that I do, I often think about the Sakhi or story from Sikh history and how investing in other people, investing in our communities is really the best use of my time and my talents. But also I have in my position, I have the privilege of working with Sikh community members across the country who give back and give back freely. And that is a true privilege and honor to witness.
Thank you, Rucha. Thank you, all of you. I really appreciate it. It's a great way to start our conversation. So I'm just to let everyone know where we're going from here. I have a few questions for our panel, but I would also encourage anyone at the conference to put questions in the chat. We'll definitely have some time for your questions as well as mine. And then immediately after, or as the sort of second part of our conversation right now, we're going to go back into breakout rooms at about 11:30 with one of our panelists in each breakout room. So you'll have a chance more up close and personal to speak with our panelists and continue the conversation. But for the moment, I just would encourage you, if you have questions or issues that are on your mind, please put those in the chat. But I have a couple things to pose to you guys to get started. First, I wanted to ask a little bit more about the terminology that we're using, not just in this conversation, but throughout the day. We often talk about food security, which I know is different and in some ways broader than just responding to hunger, right? So making sure that people have food security is a core concept. But then we also are using the term food justice, which I would think is broader than just, there's more at stake in food justice than just making sure that people have enough to eat, as profoundly important as that is. So I wonder, could you guys say a little more about that distinction? What do you see falling under the term food justice as a broad term? Kiana, if I could start with you, I know you used both those terms at different points in your introductory remarks, but maybe let's start with you, but I would love to get to everyone on this question as well.
Sure. I think food justice is really an intersectional issue, right? So it really is intersecting with many other systems of justice or injustice as we may have them in society. And namely, I want to sort of put forward like institutional racism, I think is sort of at the center of our food injustice issues that we encounter. And that is, encompassing also of environmental and ecological sustainability, workers' rights, farm and land ownership, farmed animal advocacy and treatment, and of course, the ways in which we have a industrial food system whereby communities of color typically are disproportionately impacted by the laws and regulations that we have in place, particularly in this country, that restrict their access to land ownership, food production avenues, and also food access in locally available and affordable ways. So we have terminology out there, right? Like food deserts, where we know about areas where there is not access to affordable, healthy, dignified food within a certain geographic area that everyone can access. And we know that communities of color are more likely to live in food deserts across the United States and in much of the world. So I think when we're thinking about food justice, we're really thinking about a much deeper issue. And in order to address the food insecurity that I think all of our communities are experiencing in some way, it's going to require getting to the roots of some of these injustices in a much deeper sense than just food insecurity.
Thank you. Other panelists want to weigh in your understanding of food justice or respond to anything that Kiana raised?
I'm happy to jump in. I think
Please.
To me, and from my perch, Langar at its core is about food justice, because the basic principle of Langar is that anyone can come and help make Langar. Anyone can come and eat. And that food is accessible to everyone because it is lacto-vegetarian. So it adheres to a variety of different diet restrictions. It does not matter what your background is or who you are, where you come from. You're always welcome to come to a Gurdwara. You're always welcome to join Langar. And I think when we think about the socio-political context of when Sikhi came about, late 1400s, early 1500s, and the divisions in the social-political environment in India and Pakistan at the time, which is where Sikhi came about. When we think about the divisions that were existing, when we think about how people would not come together and eat together because that wasn't allowed, or who made food was very restricted, who had access to knowledge about food, about faith in general was very restricted. At that time, at a time like that, to say that women were not allowed to be in certain spaces. At that time, to say that everybody's welcome, everybody sits together, everybody eats together, to me is nothing short of groundbreaking, and to me is about food justice. It is about, to me, it's almost like bringing everybody together through food and challenging the injustices that were prevalent at the time and continue to be prevalent in some ways today.
Yeah, thank you. And can I ask you one quick follow-up on that? Because I was interested you noted before, not only is it that everyone is welcome to come eat, everyone is welcome to come prepare the food together, which to me sounds very important as a principle of food justice, that everyone is welcome to become a part of the food system and to be fully participate. So how does that work at a gurdwara? If someone just kind of shows up, they can like go in the kitchen and
yes, everybody's welcome at a gurdwara. Like I said, the protocol is we take our shoes off, we cover our heads. That's the protocol for everybody, but outside, and no intoxicants of any kind on the premises. That's the protocol. And as long as we're following that protocol, everybody's welcome. Yes, absolutely. Please come into the kitchen. We're making North Indian food most of the time. So yes, please join in. Obviously, some folks are better at it than others, but everybody's very nice, and we'll leave some things for novices like me to join in, because they're also making food for large quantities. But as I also wanted to talk about like the community, when I say in my perch as the community development director, the community in the past many years has taken this understanding of langar and taken it outside of the gurdwara. So when COVID is ongoing, Sikhs are out there serving food. When there is a disaster somewhere in the world, Sikhs are out there serving. And part of that is, and others are joining them, part of that is just coming together and serving however you're able to. If you're able to donate money, that's great. But that's not enough. As a Sikh, I need to do more than donate money. I also need to donate my time. I need to donate my services. I actually need to, the Seva, that Selfless Service Act, is actually putting yourself in, but everybody's welcome. So yes, you're welcome to come to a gurdwara. The gurdwara is run by volunteers, and as is the kitchen. So yeah, you can cut vegetables if that's what you would like to do, or learn how to make gurdwara dal or lentils. It never tastes the same at home. It just doesn't. It always tastes better at the gurdwara. But yes, everybody's welcome. And again, that element of community and bringing people together is really important.
Thank you. I wonder, Lyla June, I wonder if could I ask you to talk a little bit about this broader issues of food justice as well? Because I know in your opening remarks, you raised questions about land ownership and stewardship. And certainly, I mean, I'm about to oversimplify hundreds of years of history, but the experience of Native American communities under colonialism and imperialism, there's deep justice issues wrapped up in control of the land. So can you say a little more about how food justice speaks to those broader issues?
Yeah, I mean, food justice from an indigenous lens is definitely multifaceted. For one thing, I think there's a justice of what you talked about of dispossession and murder. They killed about 98% of indigenous peoples when they came to this land. So because we're such a small population, because of the genocide of indigenous peoples, we don't have a lot of voice even to vote, right? Because we make up about 1% of the population. And so politicians and governments don't really care about the constituency of indigenous peoples because we don't have a very large voting bloc. And that's because they killed us all. So it's sort of an issue of representation in our own homeland, and always being ignored, always being the last to be thought about in a lot of policies. In fact, a lot of immigrant communities are much more thought about than indigenous peoples. And of course, Euro-American culture is much more thought about than indigenous peoples. So it's this very ironic thing that the peoples whose homeland we are on are those who are usually left out of the discussion and left out of the decision-making the most, directly because of not just the genocide, but also because of the boarding school era, and many, many policies that were devised and continue to be devised to disempower and marginalize Indigenous peoples in this country. So there's that, of course. Another form of food justice I feel for Indigenous peoples is sort of the work that I did in the dissertation, which is all about correcting the record. There's a huge narrative battle, you know, just like we're seeing unfold in Palestine. There's this narrative battle, right? Of who's who and what's what, and there's this huge nuclear superpower just demolishing, you know, the most dense, one of the most densely populated, porous places in the world, and yet somehow they're seen as terrorists in some narratives. So similarly, in the United States, we were painted as the terrorists, as the savages, as the terrible ones, you know, when we were just getting like pummeled by this very bloodthirsty machine, which was only bloodthirsty, right, because of the trauma they had been through already in Europe. So much trauma had been building up for thousands of years, and it kind of boiled over onto our lands. But anyways, in that process, there's a narrative battle, right? Indigenous peoples are stupid. Indigenous peoples are primitive. Indigenous peoples are anything civilized they have Europeans brought to them, right? Like the notion that there actually is just a huge study came out showing that Native Americans did have horses prior to Columbus's arrival. And why did they say we only had horses when Europeans came? Because horses are a symbol of civilization. And so there's all this huge narrative battle to say we are not civilized. And so it's just really important for Indigenous peoples to reclaim their history and say, no, we had cultivation, we had domesticated animals, we had broad food systems. And so a lot of my work is correcting the historical record and saying, actually, y'all have had the wonderful luxury of writing history for centuries now, and it's very inaccurate, right? And it's designed to denigrate Indigenous peoples. So we're going to bring our food history out again and say, actually, we didn't follow the buffalo followed us, and the ways that we would manage and expand prairie habitat through routine burning of the land, which opened up meadow, brought ashes into the soil, unlocked pyro-adapted seeds, etc. So anyways, there's really that reclaiming of food history, and the third thing I would say is that as Indigenous peoples, we definitely have the food justice issue of simply extending our ethics beyond the human realm. So in other words, food justice is not about necessarily just poor human communities having access to foods, although that is a very important part. Food justice also is about honoring all life forms, whether they are plants or animals or insects or birds or microbes. Each and every one of these beings deserves justice. And so our Indigenous food systems are very much about caring for all life, caring for all kinds of beings, and extending justice beyond just the Homo sapiens, you know? And even the word food is kind of this is going to be a little bit philosophical, but even the word food is a bit disrespectful to animals, because it reduces this living, breathing being that gave its life so that we can live to food, when actually it's energy, it's sustenance, it's beauty, and it's life itself. I don't know if any of us here would give our life right now so that someone else in here could live, but that's what our animal relatives do for us every single day. And so well,
thank you, but I'm sorry, but in interest of time, I want to kind of shift a little bit to a different set of questions. But thank you so much, and I appreciate that. To me, that resonates with some of what Yamina was saying before, of thinking about food as sacrifice and really honoring the sacrifice of an animal that enters the food system. But I wanted to shift a little bit because we have limited time, unfortunately. And I wanted to shift to this question that a few of you have raised, maybe all of you in different ways, the importance of food in bringing people together. A couple of you have used the phrase breaking bread. And I wonder if we could just unpack that a little more, from the perspective, from your faith tradition or cultural tradition. This might be like too big or broad of a way to put it, but what gives food that like unique power when people, I mean, it's almost like a cultural universal. You want to build relationships, come together over food. And it could be relationships between people, relationships between people and the land. Like, what accounts for that power of food? Yamina, go for it.
Hi, thank you so much, Lyla, for everything that you mentioned. It does definitely resonate a lot with what Muslims Giving Back stands for with regards to food and our relationship with it as being sustenance, a form of sustenance, to ensure that we engage with what we are using, especially when it comes to the animals that we sacrifice. So in Islam, the animals that we use to sustain us, right? We are not supposed to overuse or abuse them in a sense. We are not supposed to, we're supposed to have a very balanced diet with regards to that, not to overindulge in the food. And however much little or a lot you have, you always share and break with the community members, with your neighbors, even if it's one, like a loaf of bread and a neighbor comes in, you are to share that. And that is what our Prophet Muhammad ﷺ has engaged us and taught us. Those who feed and drink with each other, especially during the month of Ramadan, will get ample amounts of blessings and forgiveness from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So by sharing, we are ultimately strengthening our bonds of brotherhood within our communities and our fellow Muslims. And this strength brings our togetherness in society, and it's imperative that we build on that. And when it comes to breaking sustenance, when a person is hungry, right, hasn't eaten or hasn't imbibed throughout the day and is sitting down and sharing a meal with someone, a neighbor, a beloved, or just being provided with that form of sustenance, that emotion, that euphoria, that the feelings that you get from consuming that sustenance is very important. And this is where Muslims Giving Back sets that platform with regards to addressing the food insecurity needs within our community and providing, hot meals as a form of introduction to services, to hello, here's a meal for you, a warm meal for you. What can we do to provide additional help and support from wherever you're standing, whatever platform you're in, whatever situation you may be in. And it's imperative that we build on that and these types of relationship. And we see that there is a scarcity with regards to mindful actions and lack of resources when it comes to culturally competent services within our community. And as nonprofit organizations and faith leaders and persons in charge, we try to build on those disparities and those gaps. And it's imperative that we do so and continue to do so hand in hand and not make it so much of a competition, right? Because I feel like it gets very competitive in trying to address these needs and forgetting the fact that these are humans, these are people, and breaking that bread and sitting down and having that meal is important for us to have a conversation alongside with it. And it's not just to, check it off the books and say, mission accomplished. I did it. Do I feel good about it now?
Yeah, thank you. Anyone else on breaking bread? Kiana, you, if I could ask you, you used that expression before in sort of talking about efforts to have members of B'nai Jeshurun break bread with neighbors as part of your food service programs, food justice programs. How does that work in your setting and in Jewish tradition, if you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think like so many traditions, food plays a really vital role. We have our own sort of historical biblical texts around kashrut laws, or the laws of what food is kosher or acceptable to eat and what isn't, and how, similarly to some of my fellow panelists, how animals should be raised and treated and sacrificed for food. And we also have a lot in our text around agricultural practices and how they relate to feeding people who are hungry. And so those things are really enmeshed together in all of our texts and all of our teachings. And I think something that really speaks to me when I think about my Jewish values around food and food access and food justice is this idea that, and I know one of my fellow panelists mentioned this as well, like the idea that we are all created in a divine image, and that your health, your value of life, your dignity is wrapped up with mind, and that is true for all people. And so we're not talking about giving food as just an act of charity, but really it's how we think about being in a just world, living in a just world, building a just world, where we are all really responsible for each other's wellness and health. And so I think when we talk about breaking bread in community, right, it's really, especially when we're talking about doing so in community with people who may not be able to otherwise have access to the same types of hot, homemade, catered, whatever types of meals we're talking about, we're really thinking critically about what it means to be in relationship with people, to build bridges with people, and how food can be a means of that. Yeah, I'll rest there.
Yeah, no, I love that it, you know, it brings up the whole, you scratch the surface of the simple act of sitting down for a meal together, and you get to, you know, human interconnection and the principle of all being created in the image of God. It's lovely. There's depth upon depth in a conversation about food justice. One other question from me, and then I do still want to turn to questions from the chat in a moment, I hope. But I wonder if folks could talk about any of the kind of unique concerns that your own communities, religious or cultural communities, may have about you know, specific foods that are required by your faith traditions. Yamina, you already mentioned the importance of halal and gave a kind of, you know, a quick introduction to halal principles. And Kiana, you've mentioned kashrut, but haven't really talked about it in detail. But just to say, I think this is an important food justice issue as well, because one of the things in our keynote presentation earlier that just like really hit me, broke my heart, was the learning that, you know, some students in New York City public schools are just not eating lunch because they don't trust or they don't have faith in the you know, cultural and religious appropriateness of the food. So you know, the people's need to respect their you know, religious and cultural food traditions in some ways can become a barrier or a food justice issue. So I'm sorry, I'm not I'm kind of rambling a little bit on this question. I apologize. But what I'm wondering is how each of your communities are working to provide culturally and religiously appropriate food in a way that, you know, meets that satisfies the need for food justice while also you know, allowing people to maintain their religious and cultural traditions. Yamina, go for it.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Henry. Food within the school systems, halal food specifically, has been an issue. I was a student of the public school system, and I didn't trust the food that was being served. So yes, I was one of those students that sat out of lunch, didn't go to lunch, just went to the library and just did whatever else. And I feel like it's still a redundant issue until as of recent, where we are attempting to figure that divide. But the way to address that has been, okay, provide them with vegan meals. That should be sufficient. as opposed to actually halal meals and halal certified food products and meats. These students aren't really engaged within their culturally competent food restrictions of like, okay, here's a halal chicken sandwich, as opposed to, oh, you can do with just a vegan meal. But that's not part of the culture that these individuals are growing in. And if we're trying to address the food insecurity needs, this may be the only meal that this observant Muslim family member is receiving through the school, right? And it's 3 meals there that these children may be missing out on in this opportunity. It's like, I don't know, this doesn't look familiar to the food that I've typically consumed, so I'm not going to consume it, even though they market it as halal. It's still, I think we still have a lot to work on with that regard. And another issue that Muslims Giving Back has been in the forefront of and addressing is the migrant issue within the shelter spaces. There's a huge influx of Muslim migrants that are not being served with halal meals. And this is the reason why Muslims Giving Back via Hunger Truck has been in the forefront addressing these needs of said community members, being there and like throughout all throughout the city, serving these respite and shelter spaces with halal meals. And sometimes it's the only halal meal that these migrant community members have access to, being that it's the dietary restricted halal food services. And the other option is a PB&J sandwich or a cheese sandwich that we don't know if it is actually halal cheese, being that it may have some form of enzyme that doesn't reform with our restrictions of being certified halal. So here we are in a, again, broken system that we are trying to address, with just one hand. So yes, providing or attempting to provide a vegan option may be all great and dandy, but if we are trying to provide a culturally competent and culturally sensitive, program, then we need to be mindful of the communities that we are serving and dignify them in those services, right? And it comes down to that one word is dignity, right? And we want to ensure that the individuals that we are serving are in fact dignified. And in part of that is learning their culture and trying to meet and close off whatever gaps and disparities of services that we see.
Thank you. Yeah, and I really appreciate that. As in our keynote presentation earlier, we talked quite a bit about the shift towards plant-based foods, and there's a lot of important environmental arguments, but it's just such an important reminder that for many cultural and religious traditions, having access to meat prepared according to your culture's and religion's standards is part of human dignity. Maybe, sorry, Mayor Adams, but perhaps plant-based is not the right thing for all New Yorkers. Anyone else want to get in on questions about the sort of specific food needs of your own faith communities or cultural communities? Oh,
Yeah,
Lyla,
I can
June,
speak
go
to
for
that a
it.
little bit.
But go for it. But
Yeah.
relatively briefly, we're going to go into breaking rooms pretty soon.
Okay, how many seconds or minutes should I do?
I'm not counting that precisely.
1 minute. Okay,
Sure.
okay. I just don't want to. Yeah. Okay.
Go for it.
Yeah, I think for Indigenous folks, although I know I don't really like to focus too much on any one silo, but I know that we have most people designate us as anemic or iron poor, but we just ate a lot of red meat in our evolutionary history, whether it was deer or antelope or buffalo. Of course, the salmon nations would eat like 300 kilograms of salmon a year or something crazy like that. And so there's like very ancestral foods that I think no matter who we are on this Zoom call, each of us has ancestral foods that are unique to our DNA. And I think they're just really important to consider. And there's some folks in India who haven't eaten meat in like thousands of years, and then there's other people who have been in a relationship with the bison or the salmon or the oyster or what have you for thousands of years. And what we're finding is that everybody's DNA is different. And so to your point, Dr. Goldschmidt, it really doesn't matter like what solution you have, it's not going to cure everyone's needs. So it's really thinking about our ancestral diets, our DNA, what those relationships were, and not only eating those foods, but coming back into relationship with those living beings before they're dead, before they're on our plate, but having a living relationship with those plants and animals that our ancestors had is very healing in my experience.
Thank you. We really just have another moment or two before we go to breakout rooms. I just want to acknowledge there's been a pretty vibrant conversation in the chat, responding to the analogy that Dr. Lyla June drew before between Native American experiences and the current issues in Israel and Palestine. I want to just acknowledge the importance of that conversation, and at the same time say that we're not going to go there it's not the main topic of it's not our main focus today in thinking about food security and food justice. So to be frank, it's one of the things that I actually really value about Zoom conferences, is that you can have a really rich dialogue in the chat that might not be the main focus of the conversation for the day. But if anyone else has, there's also, I should say, in the chat, there's been some references to really interesting work on from Christian tradition on a book called The Meal That Reconnects: Eucharistic Eating and the Global Food Crisis, which sounds fantastic. And someone talked about another book about the dinner church movement, which is church communities that make the entire sort of liturgy of the church gathering around a meal. So there's a lot of fantastic resources in the chat. And again, there's a rich, complicated conversation about Israel and Palestine, but I don't see any specific questions for our panelists, which is okay, because in fact, we need to kind of close this part of the conversation, and we're going to go into breakout rooms. Before we do, let me just again thank Rucha Kaur, Kiana Davis, Lyla June Johnston, and Yamina Kezadri. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and perspectives. And let me turn it over to our fearless leader, Hanedi, who will send us into breakout rooms.